My name is Richard Lovell. Most people just call me Rick, though these days hardly anyone calls me anything at all. I'm 81 years old, a retired railroad engineer from Warsaw, Wisconsin. I've been living alone since my wife Mabel passed away 6 years ago in early spring. She went quietly, like a feather falling in the wind, one moment reading her gardening magazine, the next slumped over with a soft sigh. They said it was her heart. I suppose that was fitting. Mabel always gave too much of it. She was the kind of woman who remembered the name of the boy who delivered our newspaper and asked about his mother every Tuesday, who kept a tin of cookies ready in case the mailman looked tired. She had a softness I never fully understood until it was gone. The house we shared for over 50 years feels like a museum now. Not grand or historic, just full of ghosts. Her teacups are still stacked in the corner cupboard, dust settling in the painted ridges of tiny porcelain flowers. The bedroom is a shrine to better days. 2 pillows on the bed, though I've only needed one for years. The closet still holds her cardigans, some of them with that faint scent of lavender sachets. I haven't had the heart to pack them away. What would be the point? Each time I try, I find myself sitting on the floor with a sweater in my lap, paralyzed by a memory I didn't know I had. My days follow a routine now, not out of discipline, but necessity. I wake up around 6, not because I'm rested, but because sleep has grown shallow, like a puddle that dries up too quickly. I make oatmeal the way Mabel used to like it, with cinnamon and a few raisins. I set out 2 bowls by habit, then put one away. I read the obituaries in the Warsaw Daily Herald, not out of morbidity, but because it's where most of my old friends show up now. After breakfast, I tend the front yard. The neighbors say I have the greenest lawn on the street. I don't do it for pride. I do it because Mabel loved her peonies, and I promised her they'd never wilt while I was still around. I keep that promise. I used to attend church more regularly, but lately I find it hard to sit through the services. The sermons seem too cheerful, the hymns too hollow. Sometimes I stop by just to light a candle, sit in the back pew and whisper a few words to Mabel. Her grave is at Rest Hill Cemetery, not far from the river. I go there on Sundays, sit on the worn bench beneath the willow tree, and talk to her like she's right there beside me. I tell her what I planted, how the squirrels keep digging up the bulbs, and how the world feels lonelier with each passing season. She doesn't answer, of course, but I swear I can feel her listening. I have 3 children, though sometimes it feels like I have none. Diane is the oldest. She's 55, married to Alan, an accountant who once offered me unsolicited advice on asset repositioning at Mabel's funeral. They live in Madison in a big house with granite countertops and 4 guest bathrooms. I haven't been invited to see any of them. Diane calls me every few weeks, usually when she's driving somewhere or between meetings. The calls are always the same. How are you, Dad? Eating well? Taking your pills? Good. Got to run. I answer honestly, which is to say I lie. I tell her I'm fine, the house is fine, the neighbors are fine, the doctor says I'm healthy as a horse. Then we hang up, and the silence returns like a blanket soaked in water. My middle son, Michael, lives in Arizona. He sends Christmas cards. No return address, no note inside. Just a photograph of him and his second wife smiling in front of a mountain or a golf cart. I keep them in a drawer. I don't know why. Maybe I still hope one day he'll write something more personal. Maybe I'm just afraid to throw them away and admit how far we've drifted. Then there's Jeffrey, my youngest. He died 15 years ago. Overdose. He was always the gentle one, the one who wanted to be a writer, who cried when we ran over a bird on a road trip to Michigan. I should have done more. I think about that night a lot. The phone call. The way Mabel dropped the casserole dish when I said his name. We buried him in the same cemetery where Mabel now rests. Sometimes I wonder if that's what finally broke her heart. I suppose I'm not a bad man. I worked hard, paid off the house, took my kids to the lake, showed up at every school play and Little League game. But somewhere along the line, the threads between us frayed. Maybe it was because I wasn't good at saying the right things. Maybe it's because I wasn't as warm as Mabel. Or maybe, as Diane once said during an argument, I've always been better at loving routine than people. The last real conversation I had with Diane was nearly a year ago, after I slipped on the icy porch step and bruised my hip. She came by, stayed for 20 minutes, rearranged the pill bottles, and told me I should consider alternatives to living alone. I told her I wasn't ready to give up my home. She said, "It's not about readiness, Dad. It's about reality." That word, reality. It sat in the room like a brick on my chest. After that, things went quiet again. She'd text me photos of her dog in a Halloween costume or forward me articles about aging in place, as if hyperlinks could substitute for presence. I started having groceries delivered, stopped driving after my vision started blurring at night. The independence I once guarded like gold began to feel like a cage. Still, I managed. I had the garden. I had Mabel's chair by the window. I had my memories. And I had peace. Not joy, not connection, but peace. Until last month, when Diane called and offered to take me on a little drive. She said she and Alan were heading up north for the weekend and thought it would be a nice family gesture to stop by Rest Hill to visit Mom's grave together. "It's been a while," she said, "and I know how much you miss her." I did. I still do. So I said yes, though I hesitated. The timing seemed strange. The anniversary of Mabel's passing wasn't for another 2 months. But Diane insisted it would be just a short drive, and I chose to believe her. Maybe, I thought, this was the beginning of something. Maybe my daughter remembered I still existed, still mattered. I packed my coat and gloves, trimmed the roses from Mabel's bush, wrapped them carefully in paper towels, and waited by the window for their car to arrive. I should have listened to that voice in my gut. The one that had learned over these long years to be suspicious of sudden kindness. But I didn't. I still wanted to believe in family. I still wanted to believe in love. The morning of the drive began with the kind of gray sky that feels undecided, neither threatening rain nor promising sun. I stood at the window in my front room, watching the street like I used to when Mabel would run late from the grocery store, pacing softly in slippers worn thin at the heel. I had clipped the last of the late summer roses from her garden, wrapped the stems in the damp paper towel and aluminum foil, and placed them gently inside a shoebox lined with one of her handkerchiefs. They looked smaller than I remembered, maybe because the bush had aged with me, or maybe because everything seemed to shrink these days. My body, my world, my expectations. Diane had said they'd arrive around 10. At 10:15, I checked the wall clock above the fireplace. It had ticked reliably for over 30 years, a wedding anniversary gift from Mabel's sister who passed not long after giving it. 10:30 came, and I began to wonder whether I had misunderstood. I debated calling her, but thought better of it. I didn't want to seem impatient or make her feel guilty. That's the trap old age sets. You begin to worry that your very presence is a burden, that asking for clarity is an act of defiance. So I waited. They pulled up at 10:47 in a silver SUV, newer than the last time I'd seen their car, clean and gleaming. Diane stepped out from the passenger side, dressed in slate-gray slacks and a blouse that looked expensive. She didn't wave. Alan stayed in the driver's seat, sunglasses on, engine still running, his fingers drumming a pattern against the steering wheel like he was warming up for a performance. I stepped out with the shoebox, careful down the front steps, holding the rail. My knees had been uncooperative lately. Stiff in the morning and unpredictable on slopes. But I managed. Diane opened the back door for me, but didn't help with my box, only frowned and asked, "You sure you want to bring that?" I told her they were roses for her mother. "Right," she said. "Of course." She looked away, and I climbed into the back seat, placing the box gently beside me. The ride began in silence, apart from the low hum of the tires against the asphalt. I noticed she didn't turn to greet me once she'd settled in. She was busy on her phone, thumbs tapping, eyes scanning. Alan adjusted the mirrors without saying a word to me. Eventually I broke the silence by asking how her dog, Benny, was doing. She blinked, like she'd forgotten I was there, then replied, "Still anxious. He's on medication." I nodded and said nothing more. We passed a sign for the interstate, and I realized we weren't taking the usual road to the cemetery. I assumed maybe they knew a better route, some shortcut, or that they wanted to stop somewhere first. I didn't ask. I didn't want to be difficult. About half an hour in, Diane turned slightly in her seat and asked, almost mechanically, if I had remembered to bring my medications. I said yes, that I took my pills with breakfast. She asked if I brought extras, just in case. That struck me as odd. "Just in case of what?" I asked. But she waved it off with a little laugh. "Oh, you never know. Roads can get closed, weather changes. It's better to be prepared." I wanted to say we were only going to the cemetery and back, but something in her tone made me hold my tongue. I stared out the window. We were passing through unfamiliar territory now. Long stretches of farmland I didn't recognize. Silos standing like sentinels in the distance. I hadn't been down this road before. My throat felt dry, but I kept my worries to myself. When I finally asked if we were still heading toward Rest Hill, Alan gave a half chuckle and said, "Takes a different route, don't worry." "It's just a short drive," Diane added. "We thought we'd stop at the old church along the way. You know, the one you and Mom used to go to before moving to Warsaw. Might be nice to see it again." Her voice was smooth, practiced, too smooth. I didn't like it. But I nodded and tried to trust. That's the thing about family. Even after all the disappointments, the broken promises and silences, and the Christmases spent alone, you keep finding ways to give them the benefit of the doubt. It's like a reflex embedded deep in your bones. They didn't play music. The only soundtrack was the low roar of the road and the occasional buzz of Diane's phone. I watched the clouds drift lazily across the sky and thought about how Mabel would have been humming something under her breath by now, some old hymn or radio tune. We used to take drives like this just to see the trees change in October, to find antique shops in towns so small they didn't appear on most maps. Those drives were filled with laughter and shared sandwiches, warm coffee in thermoses, the radio playing scratchy AM jazz. This drive was cold, antiseptic, and silent. Eventually, the car pulled onto a narrow gravel road, lined with crooked trees and broken fences. It was a path that clearly led somewhere quiet and remote. I began to feel an unease growing in my chest. This wasn't the way to any church I remembered, and it certainly wasn't the road to Rest Hill. The gravel crackled under the tires as we crept along until the trees parted, revealing a small, neglected cemetery behind rusted gates. The headstones were old and thin, leaning slightly as if tired from standing so long. I looked around, bewildered. I'd never been here before. The gate bore no sign, no name, just vines and rust and the creak of hinges as Alan pulled over and put the car in the park. Diane turned to me with a flat smile. "We thought it might be nice to give you a moment here. Some quiet. We'll park just up the road. Be back in a bit." I stared at her, then at Alan. "What is this place?" I asked. Diane didn't answer. She just opened her door and stepped out. Alan leaned over, popped my door open and said, "Stretch your legs a bit, Rick." "It's good for you," I hesitated, then stepped out, bringing the shoebox with me. The gravel felt uneven under my feet. As I turned to ask when they'd be back, Diane was already walking briskly toward the car. Alan climbed in. I called out, "Wait, how long?" Diane turned back and said, "Just a short drive. We'll be back soon. Just sit, breathe. You'll be fine." Then the SUV backed up, made a U-turn, and rolled away down the gravel path, disappearing behind the curtain of trees. I stood alone in the wind, roses in hand, my heart thudding against my ribs. There was no bench nearby, no place to rest, only the crunch of my shoes on the gravel and the sighing of the trees around me. I waited. 5 minutes, then 10, then 20. No sound but the occasional caw of a distant crow. The realization crept in slowly, like water rising at your ankles. They weren't coming back. Not soon. Maybe not at all. I looked around again at the overgrown graves, the cracked marble, the quiet decay. The shoebox trembled in my hands. I placed it down gently on a stone wall and lowered myself beside it, legs stiff, breath shallow. And I began to understand. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't forgetfulness or a detour gone wrong. They had left me here. Deliberately. I sat on the low stone wall for a long while, unable to move, not because I was in pain or too weak, but because something inside me refused to accept what had just happened. I stared at the gravel road, expecting to see the SUV return any minute, expecting to hear the crunch of tires, the slam of a car door, the half-hearted apology, the forced smile. Nothing. Just whined through the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird that sounded far too cheerful for a day like this. The cemetery stretched behind me in a lopsided sprawl, rows of forgotten stones, some leaning, some broken, names faded, dates illegible, as though the earth itself was trying to reclaim what had once been human. The gate stood open behind me, the metal bent, one hinge hanging loose. I looked at my watch. 11:40. They had dropped me here nearly 30 minutes ago. That was more than enough time to find a parking spot, more than enough time to return. But no one came. I stood up slowly, legs stiff, knees aching from the cold stone. I brushed the dust from my coat, picked up the shoebox, and walked further into the cemetery, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know what else to do. The gravel gave way to uneven dirt paths, overgrown with weeds. I passed a statue of an angel with a broken wing, its face smoothed by time and weather. A black bird landed on its shoulder, then flew off. It felt like a warning. I found a newer section, where the grass was more trimmed and the stones were upright. There, I sat again on a small concrete bench beside a modest headstone with the name Lavinia Gray, 1924 to 2001. I didn't know her, but she would have to do. I placed the shoebox beside me and folded my hands in my lap. A lump was forming in my throat, a tight knot I hadn't felt in years. The kind of knot that came when you realized something irrevocable had just happened. My first instinct was denial. Surely this wasn't intentional. Surely Diane and Alan had meant to come back. Maybe the car broke down. Maybe there had been an emergency. Maybe this was all just a misunderstanding. But then the pieces began to fall into place. Not just from today, but from the past year, maybe longer. The way Diane had spoken to me like I was a child. The way Alan never looked me in the eye. The fact that they'd insisted on bringing me here. To a place I didn't recognize. To a cemetery that wasn't my wife's resting place. Under the pretense of a family visit. And then, of course, the growing pressure over the last year about my safety, the subtle comments about assisted living, about how being alone at your age is dangerous, about not waiting too long to make smart decisions. They weren't just words. They were stepping stones toward something, and today I had finally arrived at the end of that path. My mouth was dry. I had no water, no phone, no wallet. I hadn't thought to bring them. I was going to visit my wife's grave, not prepare for exile. The only thing I had was a light jacket, the shoebox of roses, and a growing sense of panic. I stood again, my legs steadier now, driven more by fear than strength. I walked back toward the road, retracing my steps, my eyes darting left and right for signs of movement. When I reached the gravel entrance, I looked both ways. The road curved sharply in both directions, disappearing into woods. No signage, no parked cars, no sound of engines. I picked a direction, left, and started walking. The road was narrow and the gravel cut into my shoes. My breath came quicker than I liked, and my chest ached after the first mile. Still, I walked, hoping to reach a gas station or a farmhouse, any sign of civilization. The sun was starting to peek through the clouds, but it offered little warmth. I removed my jacket and carried it over my shoulder to cool down. After what felt like an hour, I spotted a mailbox ahead, its red flag up, sitting on a post, leaning like a drunk man. The house behind it was modest, with faded green siding and a porch swing swaying gently in the breeze. I walked up the gravel driveway, heart pounding. A dog barked inside, a low, territorial growl. I knocked on the door 3 times. A moment later, a man in his 70s opened it a crack. His eyes narrowed. "Help you?" he asked, wary. "I'm sorry," I said, voice hoarse. "My name is Richard Lovell. I was left near the cemetery down the road. I don't have my phone or wallet. Could I use your phone to call someone?" The man looked me over, suspicious. I saw the hesitation in his eyes, the inner calculation of risk versus pity. "Wait there," he said, and closed the door. I waited on the porch, sweat cooling on my neck. After a minute, he returned with a cordless phone. "Here," he said, holding it out. "Use it out here. Don't mind the dog." "Thank you," I said, taking the phone with a slight tremble in my hands. I dialed Diane's number from memory, a habit built from years of birthdays and emergencies and nothing calls. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. "Diane, it's me. I don't know what's going on, but I need you to come get me. Please call this number back." I read the house number from the mailbox and the road from the Green Street sign near the porch. "Please, just tell me what's happening." I handed the phone back to the man. He gave me a long look, then said, "Do you want to wait on the swing? I can bring you some water." "That would be kind," I said, not trusting my voice to say more. He brought me a glass and sat in the doorway, watching me like one might watch a stray dog that could bite or beg. I didn't blame him. The world is no longer a place where strangers offer comfort without suspicion. When the phone rang a few minutes later, he stepped inside to answer, then leaned back out. "It's her," he said, handing me the phone. "Diane," I said. "Dad?" Her voice came through oddly calm. "You shouldn't be calling strangers homes. We were going to come back. You left me at a cemetery with no water, no wallet, no idea where I was." "It was for your own good," she said, her voice cool. "You've been forgetting things. You need help, and you refuse it." "I'm not confused, Diane. I'm furious." "Dad, please," she said, lowering her voice like I was embarrassing her. "Don't make a scene. We're trying to help you. If you'd just listen." "You left me," I said again, each word deliberate. "And I think you meant to. You can't pretend this was anything else, Silence." Then she sighed. "We'll come get you. But we're not going back to your house. It's time to talk about options." "Real ones," she hung up. I sat there for a long time, the phone still warm in my hand. I thanked the man, returned the glass, and declined his offer to wait inside. I would wait at the end of the driveway where I could see them coming. An hour passed before the SUV rolled up again, tires crunching the gravel. Diane got out alone. Alan stayed in the driver's seat, arms folded, jaw tight. "Come on, Dad," she said, as if I were a misbehaving child. "Let's not drag this out." I stood but didn't move toward the car. "Where are we going?" She didn't answer right away. "Somewhere safe." That's not an answer. "You can't live alone anymore, Dad." "I have been. You fell last year. You forgot your appointment last month. You're not managing." I looked at her, really looked at her. She wasn't scared or upset. She was resolved. This had been planned. "This is kidnapping," I said. "You understand that?" She laughed, but it was hollow. "Don't be dramatic." I wanted to scream. I wanted to crumble. But instead, I walked slowly to the car, opened the back door, and got in. She thought I was giving in. But I wasn't. I was beginning to see the shape of their plan, and I would bide my time until I could break it. The drive after they picked me up was suffocating in its silence. Diane didn't speak, and Alan drove with one hand on the wheel and the other tapping steadily on his thigh, as though the rhythm kept his temper in check. I sat in the back seat, not asking questions anymore. I'd asked them all already, and none of the answers I got were real. I watched the trees blur past the window, each one looking identical to the last, like I was being taken deeper into some forest designed to erase people. I had the terrible sensation that I'd crossed some invisible threshold, one I couldn't uncross, and now I was being processed, categorized, contained. At some point, the SUV pulled into a long, private driveway leading to a house I'd never seen before. It was large and bland, the kind of house with no character, no memory in its walls. It didn't belong to anyone I knew. It was clearly rented or borrowed for the purpose of appearances. I understood then that I wasn't being taken to a facility yet. That would come later. First came this purgatory, neutral territory where they could wear down my resistance, document my confusion, collect evidence. Inside, everything smelled faintly of lemon and plastic. The living room had a leather couch, a clean carpet with no wear marks, a television mounted too high on the wall. Diane handed me a glass of water and said I should rest. She guided me to a guest room and gestured at the bed like she was tucking in a child. "You'll feel better after a nap," she said. I didn't lie down. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. I waited until I heard the door close and her footsteps retreating. Then I stood up and quietly checked the dresser drawers. Empty. The closet, just a few plastic hangers. No signs of habitation, nothing that suggested this room or this house had ever been used before. I didn't sleep. I didn't even take off my shoes. I sat upright as the day faded, the light shifting from gold to gray through the blinds. My thoughts were circling, not in panic, but in calculation. I was no longer interested in arguing with Diane. I had no interest in being heard. That time had passed. What I needed now was escape, but I couldn't just walk out the door. I didn't know where we were. I didn't have any money, phone, or ID. I was completely at their mercy. For now. Dinner was called like a summons. Diane knocked lightly and said, "Food's ready." I joined them at the table. Alan had ordered takeout. Thai food, judging by the smell. They had already opened containers and were plating things for me as if I were incapable. Diane handed me a fork wrapped in a napkin and said, "We kept it mild for you, nothing spicy." I nodded, not speaking, watching her hands. She looked tired. Not like someone who had been through stress, but like someone who had to manage a lie she couldn't control anymore. Alan, on the other hand, looked content. He poured himself a beer and started talking about refinancing options, completely oblivious to my silence. Halfway through the meal, Diane launched into what I had been expecting. "Dad, we need to talk about what comes next." I set my fork down and waited. "You can't live alone anymore. You know that, right? After today, after what happened, you wandering off, calling strangers, we need to make sure you're somewhere safe, with care." I said nothing. She took my silence as permission. We found a place. It's not a home, not in the way people think. It's a retirement community, independent living, but with staff nearby. Meals provided, medical assistance if needed. It's beautiful, really. Lots of greenery. They even have a garden club. Alan added, and we already spoke with the administrator. They have one unit available. If we sign the paperwork this week, we can lock in a discounted rate. I turned to him slowly. "And how exactly is this being paid for?" Diane smiled, the way people smile before delivering a line rehearsed in front of a mirror. "We thought it made sense to sell the house. It's too much upkeep for you anyway, and the funds would go directly into a care account." I felt my chest tighten, not with surprise, but with confirmation. That was the real reason. Not safety, not care. It was the house, the money, the inheritance they didn't want to wait for. "You've been talking about this behind my back for how long?" I asked. Diane blinked. "Dad, don't take it that way. We've been trying to find the right moment to bring it up. We've been worried about you." I leaned back in my chair, my appetite gone. "You're not worried about me. You're worried about not getting locked out before I change the locks." Alan raised his hands. "Okay, let's not be hostile. This is about planning. We can't ignore reality. That word again, Diane's favorite. Used like a weapon to corner me, but they had made one mistake. They thought they had stripped me of all options. They thought I was vulnerable, broken, dependent. What they didn't know was that while I had been sitting on that guest bed, I had made a plan. It would take time and it would require patience, but I had lived a long life. I knew how to wait, and I was still capable of doing something they had forgotten I could do. Think for myself. After dinner, I asked to use the bathroom and noticed Diane hesitate before saying yes. They were already treating me like someone who couldn't be trusted unsupervised. Inside, I opened the window, looked for a screen, found none. The drop wasn't high, maybe 8 feet. Doable. But not yet. I needed more information. I needed a phone, an address, a destination. That night I pretended to sleep, lying motionless under the covers until the house went still. Then I sat in the dark, staring at the ceiling, thinking not about revenge or rage, but about dignity, about the quiet, steady kind of dignity that Mabel had always believed in. The kind that didn't scream or break windows, but that refused to kneel. The next morning I awoke before dawn, my body stiff from the unfamiliar mattress and the stiffness of age, but my mind alert in a way it hadn't been in years. I lay still, eyes open, ears attuned to the faint movements in the house. A coffee maker sputtered in the kitchen. Cabinet doors opened and closed. Diane's voice floated down the hallway, soft, measured, speaking to someone on the phone. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the tone. That same tone she'd used when scheduling my doctor's appointment last spring without asking, as though my presence in the room was incidental. I rose slowly, stretched and dressed carefully, each movement deliberate. When I emerged, Diane was at the kitchen island sipping coffee from a travel mug, scrolling her phone. Alan was nowhere to be seen. "Morning, Dad," she said too brightly. "I hope you slept okay." "I did," I lied. "What's on the schedule today?" She blinked, caught off guard by my tone. I spoke casually, like someone who had accepted their new reality. It was important that she believed that. "Nothing much," she replied. "We thought we might take a ride later. Get you some fresh air. Then tomorrow we have a visit set up. To tour the community we talked about. Just a tour. No pressure." I nodded slowly. "That sounds reasonable." I walked to the kitchen window and looked out. The backyard was fenced, the gate latched. No neighbors in sight, just a line of evergreens that could have been planted for privacy or for secrecy. "Do you have the brochure?" I asked. She looked pleased. "Yes, of course." She pulled a glossy folder from the counter drawer and handed it to me. I flipped through it slowly. Pictures of smiling retirees playing bingo, planting flowers, sitting in circles, listening to some gray-haired man in khakis talk about legacy planning. It was sanitized, curated, a place where people went to become invisible in comfort. "It's very clean," I said. "That's what I thought," she answered. "Clean, calm, secure. You'd have your own space." "And they do game nights?" "Game nights," I repeated, like I was tasting the word. Alan returned from wherever he'd gone, dressed in business casual, carrying a manila envelope. He gave Diane a quick nod and turned to me. "We need you to sign a few things, Rick. Just to start the process. Nothing binding, just forms for preliminary interest." I took the envelope, opened it, and skimmed the top page. It was a resident evaluation form, followed by a financial disclosure and a power of attorney designation. "This one?" I said, tapping the last form. "This gives you the right to manage my assets?" "Temporarily," Alan said quickly. "Just until the transition is complete." "No pressure," Diane added. "We just want things to be smooth." "I see," I said. "And what if I don't sign?" They exchanged a glance. Alan stepped back. Diane sighed and set her mug down with exaggerated care. "Dad, we're trying to help you avoid trouble. If something were to happen, if you fell or wandered off again, we'd have to step in legally. That could be drawn out, expensive. This way, it's smooth. You trust me, don't you?" I looked at her. The daughter Mabel had once held like a porcelain doll. The girl who used to bring me dandelions as if they were gold. "I trusted you yesterday," I said quietly. Her eyes flickered. "Let me think it over," I said. "I want to do this the right way." They relaxed visibly, mistaking patience for surrender. That afternoon they left me alone in the house for the first time. Diane had errands. Alan had a meeting. "We'll be back by 3, she said. "You'll be fine." "There's lunch in the fridge," I nodded, watched the door close behind them, and waited 5 full minutes before I moved. I went first to their room, rifled quickly through drawers until I found Diane's purse. Her wallet was there, but no cash. I took the emergency key from the kitchen drawer and stepped outside, shutting the door softly behind me. The gate creaked open under my hand. I moved quickly down the side of the house, staying close to the fence line, then slipped into the street. I didn't know the neighborhood, but I followed the slope of the road, trusting that it would eventually lead me to a more populated area. After 20 minutes of walking, I reached a small commercial strip, a gas station, a laundromat, a nail salon, and, mercifully, a public library. I entered, trying not to look like a man fleeing something. The librarian, a woman about my daughter's age, looked up and smiled. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," I said. "I need to use a computer." Just for a moment, she gestured to a row of terminals. "Sign in right there. Need help logging in?" "No, thank you." Once seated, I opened a browser and searched for the retirement community Diane had shown me. It took only minutes to find reviews. A few were positive, written in the tone of PR staff posing as residents, but others were more telling. Mentions of overmedication, lost personal items, denied access to visitors. One review from a former nurse mentioned how staff were told to limit interactions with residents deemed non-compliant, a euphemism for anyone with opinions. My stomach turned. This wasn't a place for safety. It was a place to disappear someone, legally. I logged out, thanked the librarian, and asked if there was a bus line nearby. She pointed me toward the stop and handed me a map. "Where are you headed?" she asked kindly. "Home," I said, and meant it in a much broader sense. Back at the house, I returned before 3, reheated the lunch they had left, and sat at the table when they walked in as if nothing had happened. Diane smiled, relieved. "You look better," she said. "See what rest does." "I was thinking about the documents," I said, "about making things easier for everyone." She brightened. "That's wonderful, Dad." "Really, I want to do it properly," I said. "With a notary. Maybe with someone at the bank, so no one questions it later." Alan nodded. "That makes sense. We can schedule that." "Good," I said and smiled. They thought they'd won. The next morning, while they were still asleep, I returned to the library. This time I called an old friend, Ed Gleason, a man I hadn't seen in over a decade, but who had once told me, during a fishing trip, that if I ever needed anything at all, he'd come running. I didn't expect him to answer. He did, and when I told him what had happened, he didn't ask questions. He asked where to pick me up. By nightfall, I was gone. When Diane and Alan woke up the next morning, they found the bed made, the closet empty, and a single note on the kitchen table. "Do not follow." I know everything now. I spent the next few days at Ed's cabin 2 counties over. We made a plan. I called my lawyer. I froze the accounts Diane had access to. I changed the deed of the house. I closed the joint accounts, and I left a message for Diane's bank, warning them of potential fraud. I had no interest in punishing her, but I would not allow her to own me, control me, erase me under the guise of love. On the 4th day, my lawyer informed me that Diane had attempted to submit a notarized document I'd never signed. The bank flagged it, and she was now under investigation for attempted financial manipulation of a vulnerable adult. I wasn't vulnerable. Not anymore. I returned to my home, filed a police report about abandonment, and retained a new estate lawyer to write a will. One that left nothing to Diane or Alan. I designated my old friend Ed as my power of attorney and beneficiary. I donated part of my assets to a veterans charity Mabel had always supported. I gave my house to the organization that ran her hospice care, so they could fund end-of-life care for people whose children had stopped answering the phone. 3 weeks later, I received a letter from Diane. It was handwritten, short, and full of the right words, but none of the right meaning. "I'm sorry if we overstepped," it read. "We were just worried. I hope someday you understand that I didn't respond. Because I did understand. I understood everything now." The week that followed Diane's letter unfolded in a kind of silence that was heavier than solitude. I did not speak to her, nor did I mention her to anyone I encountered, and yet she was everywhere. Her shadow woven into the curtains Mabel had sewn, her voice echoing faintly in the voicemail I hadn't deleted, her smudged fingerprints still clinging to the mailbox lid where she'd once placed a grocery flyer and told me to just think about it. It is a strange thing to realize that someone who shares your blood no longer shares your life. Stranger still is realizing that despite the violence of that separation, because what else can one call abandonment, deceit, the quiet bureaucratic theft of autonomy? You feel not rage, but a calm, firm boundary rising inside you like a sea wall. I no longer cared if she understood. I no longer needed her to. But Diane didn't understand that silence was a door that closed. She kept knocking. There were more letters, more voicemails. One came late at night, her voice cracking from what might have been wine or desperation. "Dad, please, I think we went about things the wrong way. Alan's sorry, too. We only wanted what was best. You were forgetting things. You missed your eye appointment, and I just panicked. I didn't want you to burn the house down or end up like Grandpa did. Please call me. We can talk. We can fix this." She was clinging to the fantasy that the damage could be undone by apology, that relationships were like windows. Fragile, yes, but fixable with enough glue and patience. What she didn't grasp is that some breaks are not cracks, but cleavages. Fault lines that run to the center of something and split it entirely apart. I didn't respond. Instead, I focused on what needed to be done. The legal documents had been filed. My lawyer confirmed that my new will was secured, that the title to my home had been transferred to the Hospice Foundation, and that Diane and Alan's names were nowhere on any account or deed. My estate was now clean, airtight. I made copies of every form and placed them in a fireproof box under my bed, along with Mabel's letters, a few photographs, and the receipt for the suit I planned to be buried in. It felt, at last, like I had reasserted control over something no one had the right to steal. My legacy, my agency, my voice. And then, 3 days later, the doorbell rang. It was nearly noon, and I had been in the middle of trimming the overgrown hydrangeas that lined the walkway. I wiped my hands on my pants and opened the door. There, on my porch, stood Diane. She looked older, not aged by time but by circumstance. Her eyes were bloodshot, not from crying but from exhaustion. Her hair was tied in a loose bun that had clearly been fixed in a hurry. She wore a grey coat too light for the weather, and her arms were crossed not in defiance but in defense, as if she expected to be turned away. "Dad," she said, and the word struck me as false. Not because it wasn't true, but because it no longer felt like it belonged to her. "Why are you here?" I asked evenly. "I just wanted to talk. Face to face." "You've already said everything in your letters." She nodded, looking down at the porch boards. "I know. But I need you to hear me." I said nothing, and after a few seconds she continued. "I was scared," she said. "You were forgetting things. You were shutting down. You don't answer your phone. You didn't come to Hazel's graduation. I kept thinking, maybe you were slipping away and didn't know it." "You mean you were slipping away?" I said, "and wanted me to vanish with you?" She flinched, but didn't argue. That was progress, I suppose. "I know what we did was wrong," she said. "Leaving you there. That was Alan's idea, but I didn't stop him." I thought maybe, if you were scared, you'd agree to the plan. "The plan," I repeated. "To lock me away and strip my name off everything I ever built." She looked up, her eyes brimming. "It wasn't about the money." "Yes, it was." "No," she said quickly. "It was about fear. Fear that I'd already lost my mother and was going to lose my father next. Fear that you'd die alone and no one would even know until the neighbors noticed the smell. I thought I could control it. I thought if we moved fast enough, quietly enough, we could keep you safe, even from yourself." I studied her. For once, she didn't look rehearsed. There was no lawyer's tone in her voice, no calendar behind her eyes. She was raw, exposed. But the problem with finally telling the truth is that sometimes you reveal how ugly it really is. "You wanted to preserve the image of me that suited your convenience," I said. "The quiet old man in the corner who smiles, hands over checks, and says thank you when someone dictates the rest of his life. But I am not your relic, Diane. I'm your father." She stepped forward. "Then let me fix this." "You can't. Because it's not broken. It's ended, tears welled up, and I believed them. but they changed nothing. I'm not angry anymore, I said, because anger would require me to expect something of you. I don't. I release you. Go live your life. I hope it brings you peace. But I won't be part of it. She covered her mouth with one hand and nodded. She stood there for another full minute, waiting, perhaps, for some change of heart, some last door to swing open. It didn't. When she left, I did not watch her go. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The sky turned lavender, then burnt orange, then finally the blue-black of dusk. The house was quiet. The garden was watered. The lights on the neighbor's porch flicked on like clockwork. And for the first time in years, I felt not grief, not loneliness, not even triumph, but something closer to freedom. Not the kind of freedom that comes with youth or power or wealth, but the harder kind, the one that arrives after the severance of illusion. The freedom of being no one's burden, no one's puppet, no one's regret. Inside, I laid Mabel's shawl across the armchair. I whispered goodnight to her photo on the mantel, as I always did, and turned off the lights. Tomorrow would come, and I would meet it on my own terms. The fall settled in slowly that year, as if reluctant to commit, stretching September into a half-light that clung to the afternoons. The trees along my street began to yellow at the edges. The air carried the faint scent of distant burning leaves, and the neighborhood grew quieter as children returned to school. It was in this hush that I found my new rhythm. Not the one I'd been forced into by neglect or manipulation, but the one I chose for myself. Mornings were for the garden. I worked with care, kneeling slowly, brushing the soil around the bulbs Mabel had once planted with her gloved hands and humming old songs she used to play on the kitchen radio. I spoke to her, not always out loud, but with the kind of inner conversation that memory makes easy. She was in every petal, every bee that lingered on the blossoms, every ray of light that struck the window just right in the evening. In the absence of children, she had returned to me more clearly than ever. The neighbors, who had long since stopped doing more than waving, began to ask if I needed anything. Help with trash bins, rides to the pharmacy, someone to check the gutters before the frost. I accepted only what I could not do myself, not out of pride, but because I had learned the difference between being supported and being managed. There is dignity in asking when the need is real, but there is also strength in knowing when to refuse. I no longer explained myself. I no longer sought permission to age the way I chose. My lawyer called once a week, not with warnings or paperwork, but with updates. The financial audit of Diane and Alan's attempted transactions was complete. There would be no criminal charges. My decision, but they had been flagged at their bank, and their access to certain instruments had been frozen. Diane had written again, a shorter letter this time, careful and polite. She asked if I might consider a conversation. I didn't reply, not because I wished her harm, but because silence was the only truthful answer left between us. I began volunteering quietly with a hospice support group downtown, not leading sessions or offering advice. I wasn't that vain, but helping set up chairs, making coffee, organizing brochures. Sometimes I sat in the back and listened to others talk about the complicated grief that follows when death arrives after long resentment or abandonment. One woman said, "He died before we could fix it. Now I have to carry the pieces." I understood that, but I also knew something she didn't. Sometimes the pieces are better left scattered. Reassembling them only invites more sharp edges. One Tuesday afternoon, a boy no older than 10 rang my doorbell. He wore a red hoodie and carried a piece of paper folded 4 times. "Are you Mr. Lovell?" he asked shyly. I said yes. "My grandma said you fixed her heater last winter. She said you were nice. I drew you something." He handed me the paper and ran off before I could ask his name. Inside was a drawing of a house with flowers out front and a stick figure waving beside a tall woman in a green dress. The caption read, "Thank you for helping people." I taped it to the fridge beside Mabel's old recipes. On the anniversary of her passing, I returned to her grave alone. This time I brought chrysanthemums and a chair. I sat for an hour, telling her everything, not just the pain and betrayal, but the strength I'd found, the clarity, the small moments of goodness that had crept in through the cracks. I told her about the bird bath I'd installed in the garden and the 2 finches that had made it their territory. I told her about the boys' drawing. I told her that I missed her most when I got good news and had no one to tell. When I rose to leave, I felt no heaviness, just a kind of acceptance. Back at home, I poured a small glass of scotch and stepped out onto the porch. The sun was setting in ribbons of red and orange. Somewhere down the street, a wind chime stirred. I thought about the cemetery gate, the gravel road, the silence of that afternoon. It no longer haunted me. It had become something else, a line I'd crossed and survived. They had said it would be just a short drive, but it was longer than that. It was a journey I hadn't asked for, one I never wanted, but one that led me back to myself. Not as a father, not as a husband, not as an asset or a problem to be solved, but as a man with the final say over his own life. I raised my glass to the wind, to the night, to Mabel. I was still here, and I was still mine.